Hey guys. So welcome to the Guesstimates Masterclass. The temperature is really nice. It's the starting of May and it's raining in Delhi. So what can be a better day to start talking about guesstimates? Let's get into it. Let me show you actually. So let's start talking about guesstimates. The flow of this video will be that initially I'll be talking about guesstimates and how to approach them, and by the end of the video I will give you some crucial advice that you should remember while solving guesstimates and ultimately for your guesstimate interview. So first of all, what are guesstimates? As the name suggests, guesstimates are a way to guess an estimate and hence arrive at a particular number that will help you solve a particular problem. The idea is to come up with the most logical approach possible and hence arrive at that number. So ultimately, the number that you're arriving does not matter as much as the approach you are trying to follow to arrive at that number. It is something that most non-tech firms will include within their interview process in one form or another. And even if they don't have it as a direct guesstimate, they will probably give you a puzzle within which a guesstimate will be included. Now, there is no one particular or correct way to solve any guesstimate. In fact, most guesstimates will have multiple approaches to them, which is something we'll cover later on. But the most important thing for you is to build the aptitude to make sure that you know what kind of approach will be used for a particular guesstimate, and that will happen through practice. Okay, so let's take an example. Let's say I would want you to estimate the number of schools in Delhi. Pause this video right now and try to come up with an approach. Even if you don't know anything about guesstimates, just try to think, how will I arrive at what the number of schools in Delhi really is? Okay, so hopefully you have an answer, and much more importantly, hopefully you have an approach. So one of the ways that I can think about doing this is, let's say that I know the population of Delhi. Let's say that it is about 20 million people. If I know the number of people who are in the school-going population, let's say a percentage of those people are in the school-going population, which is about 25%, let's assume. And now if you think about the school that you went to, you would know roughly how many people went to that school as well. So for my school, for example, it was about 1,000 people that went to that school. And hence, if you divide the total number of people in Delhi who are going to school, so basically the total number of students in Delhi, because we arrived at that previously, and then divide that by the number of people who would go to any average school, by using basic math, you would arrive at the number of schools in Delhi. Now, since this approach used the number of people to arrive at the answer, this is called a demand-side approach. It is determined by people, it is determined by the population and their demand, and hence it's called a demand-side approach. Okay, so now what is another way that I can approach the same guesstimate? Let's say that I know that Delhi has 11 districts, and those 11 districts are split up into roughly 300 to 400 wards. You can see the ward map of Delhi over here. Now, wards are just basically smaller units than districts used for governance purposes. But the more important thing is that if you also know the area of Delhi, which is about 1500 square kilometer, you can roughly arrive at what the area in square kilometer is for an average ward. Then we arrive at 4 square kilometers for an average sized ward. So let's say that you are looking at the number of schools within a 4 square kilometer of area and then multiplying that by 400 to arrive at your final answer. Imagine a 4 square kilometer of area around you. If you would imagine that a circle is the 4 square kilometer area that we are talking about. A 4 square kilometer of area, by the way, equates to roughly 1.1 kilometers of a radius of a circle. So yeah, try and think about it. In a 1 kilometer radius away from you, imagine an entire circle. How many schools do you think that there can be in a reasonably logical manner? And as soon as you've arrived at that answer, multiply that by 350 and you will get your answer. Now, since this approach uses the constraint of the area of a particular place, this is called a supply side approach. So any approach that will have some sort of constraint put on it, whether it be a resource constraint or an area constraint, it would be a supply side approach. These two approaches, demand side and supply side, are going to be the bedrock for your preparation when it comes to guesstimates. And it becomes even more important as you realize that in a typical guesstimate interview, you might also be asked to give another approach to solve the guesstimate that you just solved. And in that case, if you had used a demand side approach earlier, you could just do a supply side approach, and that would be your second approach to solve the same guesstimate, giving you extra points in the interview. Okay, so let's come to how you should structure your guesstimates in a typical interview. First of all, understand what each thing means. And the way to do that in the interview scenario would be to simply ask your interviewer a few questions about the guesstimate. Now, let's say your guesstimate was, estimate the amount of ice cream sold in Delhi in a single day. The way that I would approach this to ask questions to my interviewer would be to focus on each word of the guesstimate itself. So let's break it down. Estimate. I don't think that there are any questions that I can think about the word estimate. It's simply the starting word of a guesstimate. The amount of. Now this is really interesting because amount can literally mean so many things. It can mean number, it can mean volume, it can mean surface area in some cases. So in this case, you should ask your interviewer, what do you mean by amount? Do you mean the number of ice creams that are sold, or do you mean the volume of that ice cream in liters? So these are two different things. The next is sold in Delhi. Now, this is another interesting thing because you can probably ask your interviewer, well, by Delhi, do you also mean the entire NCR, which would include some parts of Ghaziabad and some parts of Gurgaon? Or do you mean just the core Delhi that we know of? That may or may not change your calculations later on, but it is still something that you might want to know at the beginning of the guesstimate. The final part is in a single day. That is as standard as it can get. In a single day really doesn't mean anything apart from a 24-hour period. But if you would want to clarify, you can still go on and ask, well, how many hours are we talking about? But ultimately, I don't think that really matters a lot, and you can just move on from there. Now, there are questions that are outside of the guesstimate itself that you would have to think about, and the way to do that is ultimately practice. Now, one of the questions that I can think about when it comes to estimate the volume of ice cream sold in Delhi would be, well, what sort of distribution channels are we considering? Are we considering only ice creams that are sold by ice cream specific shops, something like Mother Dairy or Dream Bell and have more? Or are we also considering the dessert menu of restaurants? In which case your guesstimate would actually be quite different, because then you would have to figure out the desserts in all of those restaurants and then figure out, well, how much of those desserts might be ice creams. So there are questions outside of the guesstimate question itself. The second thing to do would be to ask your interviewer, let's say a few seconds or maybe even a minute, to lay down your approach. And that is what you should do. You should take some time and just lay down your entire approach and also briefly explain it to the interviewer. This will give the interviewer a sense of what you are going to do from this point on, and you actually might even get some feedback from the interviewer. He or she might say, well, that sounds good. Or they might even say, well, don't you think these factors can also be added? So yeah, in that sense, I think asking for some time and laying down your entire approach is a really good idea. The next thing to do would be to make your approach as MECE as possible. Now let's talk about MECE for a second. MECE means mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. Okay, so let's take an example to understand this. Let's say that there exists people between the age of 0 and 100 in a particular room, and I want to divide them in a few different ways. Let's say I divide them as people below the age of 50, including the people who are at the age 50, and people above the age of 50. So this is an example of something that is mutually exclusive, because those two different groups will have people without any overlap. So people below the age of 50 and people at the age of 50 are in one single group. The people above the age of 50 are in another group. There is no overlap. And also it is collectively exhaustive, because people right from the age of 0 all the way to 50, as well as people above the age of 50 all the way to 100 are all covered. So it is mutually exclusive as well as collectively exhaustive. An example of a non-mutually exclusive approach would be to say, well, let's say that there are two groups, people below the age of 50 as well as people between the ages of 40 and 100. Now there is an overlap. These two groups are not mutually exclusive, since people between the ages of 40 and 50 are actually covered in both groups. And if I were to say that, let's say I want these two groups to be people between the ages of 0 and 50, including those who are 50 years old, and then people between the ages of 51 and 70. That leaves out anyone who is above 70 years old all the way till 100 years of age. So this is not collectively exhaustive, because this does not give us the entire picture. So mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive is the way to go when you are solving guesstimates. An example of this would be something like, well, okay, so if I were to think about the amount of ice cream that was sold, I can think about it as the liters of ice cream that was sold, and then divide it further into thinking about the number of ice creams that were sold multiplied by the average number of liters for every ice cream. So when you multiply those two things, you will arrive at your answer. Now this average liter per ice cream can be a weighted average, because bricks are basically sold in 500 ml or 1 liter packs, while smaller individually packed ice creams are more like 100 or 200 ml. So that's the idea. Keep breaking things down and making it more and more exhaustive, as well as at the same time making sure that those things are exclusive of each other. So they are mutually exclusive as well as collectively exhaustive. And the last thing to do for a guesstimate would be to end with a justifiable number. Your number shouldn't be something completely out of the blue. So as an example, if you were asked to estimate the number of air conditioners in Delhi, you can immediately see that the number would be either in the hundreds of thousands or even in the millions, because there are about 20 million people in Delhi. 20 million people means that there would be around 4 or 5 million households in Delhi. And even if we take out those households that cannot afford air conditioners, there are office spaces that would require air conditioners. And hence, even if we say that every household would have one air conditioner, the number would come out to be in the millions, or in conservative cases, hundreds of thousands. If you arrive at the answer of, let's say, 2000, you should immediately know that it is wrong and ask your interviewer a couple more minutes to arrive at a better answer. While at the same time, if you were asked to calculate the number of hospitals in Delhi, and you arrive at a figure that is in the millions, you should immediately know that it is wrong, since hospitals are infrastructures that are used by multiple people, not just one household. And hence the number of hospitals in Delhi would be closer to the order of thousands, not hundreds of thousands or millions. Something that a lot of people do at the end of their guesstimates is what is called a sanity check, which is to basically approach the guesstimate in a very quick fashion and arrive at a number that would be justifiable to the number that you've arrived at the end of your actual guesstimate. One way to do this is to basically just use the other approach instead of the approach that you use for your guesstimate. So if you use the supply side approach for your guesstimate, just quickly go through a very brief demand side approach and arrive at a similar number, and that should make the number that you've arrived at more concrete. This is what is called a sanity check. Now, some crucial advice. These are some things that I wish I knew when I was starting out with my guesstimates preparation. The first thing is fix your numbers as soon as possible. So what I mean by this is that there are going to be a lot of numbers that you're going to use again and again. Doesn't matter what the guesstimate is. For example, a Delhi-related guesstimate in most cases will use the population or the area of Delhi, or even both. So you should know that if you are going to face a Delhi-based guesstimate later on, you should immediately think of 20 million and 1500 square kilometers. So fix those numbers as soon as possible. And at the same time, I will also tell you, fix your percentages as soon as possible. What I mean by that is that the distributions within, let's say, the population of Delhi. Let's say you want to say that, well, 70% of Delhi is urban and then 30% of Delhi, or even let's say an 80-20 distribution, where 80% of Delhi is urban and 20% of Delhi is rural, is one way to divide Delhi. Another way is based on income. Another way is based on age. So make sure that, let's say for age, you have people between the ages of 0 and 18, people above the age of 18 all the way till 40, people between the ages of 40 and 60, and then people who are above 60. Make sure those percentages are assigned and you know those percentages by heart, and do this for as many different cases that you can. This will make sure that you don't have to think hard about these smaller things when you are doing the guesstimate, because you can spend your time in more creative ideas and coming up with a stronger approach than these things that you should have already known. The second thing is that every guesstimate is going to be different, and it's basically going to be guided by the interviewer and what he wants you to approach the guesstimate as. The advice over here is listen to your interviewer. Your interviewer might want the guesstimate to be more calculation based, in which he's checking your mathematics over your logic. The other guesstimates, which is what happened with me, is that it may be approach based, in which they're actually just checking how well you can define your approach. Is your approach concrete or not? How many different factors can you think about, instead of just the pure calculation or pure mathematics of it all. The third thing would be to minimize vague assumptions and maximizing calculated logical assumptions. An example of a vague assumption would be something like, if you were asked something like the number of Sherlock Holmes books sold in Delhi, you might want to think of it on the basis of, well, let's say I would divide the number of books sold in Delhi into different genres, and then within the thriller/mystery genre come up with the number of Sherlock Holmes books that are sold. Now, a vague assumption would be to say something like, Well, I have come up with these 10 different genres. Let's say these are the 10 different genres. And I will just take all of them to be 10% of the total number of books that were sold. That is extremely vague. It's not based on something concrete or something that is logical. Now, a calculated and logical assumption would be when calculating the area of India, you assume it to be a rhombus, or you assume it to be two different triangles laid with their base connected. So doing this, you'll be able to come up with the area of India in no time, and at the same time, it will be based on some logical, reasonable explanation. At the same time, if you look at Delhi's map, I think you can immediately see that it much more resembles a circle than any other shape, and hence you should use the area of circle to come up with the area of Delhi instead of any other shape that you can possibly think of. Okay, so the next thing is to come up with a stop loss approach. Now, a stop loss is a concept used in the buying and selling of stocks where you can set up something called a stop loss. If you're not monitoring the market continuously and the stock price goes below a certain point, the stock will be sold automatically for you. And that is stopping your losses as much as possible. And so that is why I call this step coming up with a stop loss approach. When you're sitting in a guesstimate interview, sometimes you might be completely blank about what the interviewer is asking you about. And this is where your stop loss approach will come in. Instead of you being completely blank, you can use a typical approach that you have designed over a few weeks or over a few months, and you'll be able to give that approach to basically any guesstimate. My personal stop loss approach was the Fugate approach, which is basically where I start with the population of the particular place, then I think about the different households by dividing it by a factor of 3, 4 or 5 depending on what place it is. Then try and think about the urban-rural divide, also thinking about the gender, the age, the income, and then finally calculating the penetration based on the nature of the guesstimate that has been asked. The next thing would be to practice both the supply and the demand approaches for every guesstimate that you do. If there cannot be a demand side to the guesstimate that you are doing, then you can skip it obviously. But if your guesstimate has a small chance of having both the approaches, then I would recommend you to practice both the approaches for every guesstimate that you do. This will develop your thinking in a way that if you are asked to approach the guesstimate from another point of view, when you are doing your guesstimate interview, you'll be able to do it easily. The next thing is that practice guesstimates with a friend as soon as possible. A lot of the times we feel that we are just not ready enough to practice guesstimates with a friend because we haven't read the theory properly, or we can do a lot more on the theory part before we actually start practicing. This, I must say, only comes out of a fear of guesstimates, and you should avoid that. You should start practicing with a friend as soon as possible once you have the basics down, because that will only improve your approach and only make you better at guesstimates. The next is keep simplifying your calculations at every stage. Let's say you know the area of a particular place and that area is in the form of a circle. Let's say it is 4 square kilometers. And now you want to come at the radius. Now we know that pi r square equals 4 would be what we will be using. And the first thing would be to divide both sides by pi. Pi is 3.14, and 4 divided by 3.14 is not something you can easily do in an interview. But what you can do is 4 divided by 3. This is something you need to inculcate in your guesstimate practice, and you should accept the fact that you can only do complex calculations in guesstimate once you make things easy for you as much as possible. When you divide 4 by 3.14 and when you divide 4 by 3, the answers are not going to be too far off, but you can do 4 by 3 much more easily than say 4 by 3.14. The next thing is keep eliminating as much as possible to make your calculations easier. For example, let's say we were talking about the number of air conditioners sold in a particular place and you had an urban-rural divide. Now, at this point, you might say that, of course, there are people in rural areas who get air conditioners these days. But if you ask your interviewer, well, do you think, can I just take away the rural aspect of this and only focus on the urban aspect? Because most air conditioners are indeed sold in urban areas. And if your interviewer agrees to it, you have just made your calculations much more easier. Because if you had the rural part, you would be going into it in a much more deeper sense, only making things more complicated for you. So yeah, eliminate as much as possible, of course, with the consent of your interviewer. The last thing that I would want to say to you for guesstimates is just that you should learn to enjoy the process. Like I said before, guesstimates can be daunting when you are starting them, but they are actually really fun and they're actually very logical and intuitive once you really get into them. I remember being in this sort of phase where everything I looked at in the frame of a guesstimate. when I was going shopping to the nearby store and I saw my favorite cereal, I just started thinking about, well, how many packets of this cereal would have been sold today from this store that I'm currently shopping at. So yeah, make guesstimates fun for you. Don't be scared of them. Make the entire process enjoyable for you and relate to them as much as possible. That will only make you like guesstimates much more and ensure that on D-Day you'll be able to nail your guesstimates. Okay, so with that, we are at the end of the video. I really hope you liked it. I've included some resources in the description for you to prepare guesstimates. There are a couple of videos that you can watch and a couple of books that I use and a lot of people that I know use to nail their guesstimates. So yeah, make sure you check them out. Like I said, they're in the description. In the upcoming videos, I'll have people who are currently working at consulting firms or at big finance firms and actually going through guesstimates with them. So stay tuned for those. And yeah, that's basically it about today's video. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.